So I'm Ricardo Romo, happy to be with you all today. I'm the moderator, and I received an email telling me everything about this great gentleman here. But I was reading his book, so I like the way that it was described. So I'm going to just say something from here, and we've released something out. We'll catch you at the end. But suffice to say that he is a historian, author, and an attorney. He holds a Master's of Art in History from Sam Houston State University and a Doctorate in Law from St. Mary's University. He's an adjunct faculty at Lake University and served as the mayor of Von Army. And from 2008 to 2015, he's the author of several books and the winner of the 2016 Texas State Genealogical Society Grand Prize Book Award and 2014 Presidio La Bahia Award. This one has gotten an award, but one of the awards I can tell you is that we ran into Stephen Harrigan yesterday, who wrote a 900-page book on the history of Texas, and he saw I had this book, and he said, "That is a great book. That is the highest honor you can get, sir." So we're going to put you up, and then we're going to have to give you some time, and then we have some Q&A. Well, you tell them what you're going to do.
Thank you, Dr. Romo. It's hard to follow an act like Santiago Jimenez, but I will do my best. I don't play the accordion or anything, though. So I was asked to discuss a little bit about how the Battle of Medina influenced the Battle of the Alamo through the eyes of Jose Francisco Ruiz. The traditional narrative of Texas history views the Battle of the Alamo from the perspective of the American immigrants who began arriving a little over a decade prior under the guidance of Stephen F. Austin, who's often called the father of Texas. Some came as lawful immigrants, pledging to be loyal Catholic citizens of this new Republic of Mexico. Others came as squatters and without permission, seeking land and new opportunities. The villain in this narrative is Mexican President Santa Anna, who abridges the rights of Mexican citizens, suspends the Constitution, and marches his tyrannical army north to Texas in an epic showdown of good versus evil. The Battle of the Alamo serves as the ultimate wrong in this story, which galvanizes the Texian resistance and, despite all odds, making their stand at San Jacinto, and like David and Goliath, takes down the giant and winning their independence. It's a tale of good versus evil, liberty versus tyranny, American versus Mexican. Now, this is certainly an oversimplification of the traditional narrative, but I believe a fair synopsis of the one I learned in 7th grade Texas history class in the mid-1980s. In fact, I mastered the narrative so well that in 1987, yours truly came in first place at the TAPS statewide 7th grade history competition, and I earned a blue ribbon, arguably my most prized academic achievement. I still hang it in my office. As a youth, it was easy to view myself from the perspective of the Texians. I was, after all, born in Texas. So were my parents. And from my family stories that I had heard, we didn't know when we came to Texas, but it was certainly long ago. But among those stories I heard growing up were ones about Jose Francisco Ruiz. He had signed the Texas Declaration of Independence. He had founded a small town where my mother was from, a town called Von Army, here in Bexar County. And somehow everyone in the town seemed to either be related to him, either by blood or aspiration. As I graduated from UT in Austin, as an undergrad at UT in Austin, I began to realize that the traditional narrative I had learned was in fact a foundation myth. Every nation has one. In fact, nationalism requires it. Whether it's the gritty fortitude of the suckling twins Romulus and Remus of Rome, or the Greek-like virtuous pagan past of Neo-Aztecism in Mexico, or the American moral purity with George Washington and the cherry tree. in order to get us closer to the truth, the historian has to peel back these layers of nationalism, of hero-making, and in this case, of an American-centric perspective. It was only after I became mayor of Von Army and at the same time chose Jose Francisco Ruiz as my thesis topic for my master's degree that I began to do this. Ruiz did not fit into this national myth very well. He was a Mexican on the Texian side. How did the traditional narrative explain this? It simply didn't. The historiography of Ruiz generally lacks any depth. One can oversimplify his role as this. Ruiz appears as a fully formed Mexican federalist who sides with the Texians against the tyranny of Santa Anna, signs the Declaration of Independence, and then he exits the story and is largely forgotten. But wait, where did he come from? Why did he do this? And what came after? These were the questions I hope to answer in my thesis and eventually in my book, Tejano Patriot. And Ruiz's path went through Medina. So at the close of 1810, Ruiz was completing his term on the city council as procurador, or city attorney. He was a young lawyer. His father had died while he was a teenager, and he was mentored by his brother-in-law of 30 years older, Angel Navarro. Ruiz appeared to be on a legal career path that would eventually probably have led him to being alcalde or judge, just like his mentor, Angel Navarro. However, all of this changed as revolution came thundering towards San Antonio, and Ruiz, his world, and his path in life would never be the same. This revolutionary Pandora's box was opened by none other than Napoleon, who disrupted the political order on the Iberian Peninsula by forcing the King of Spain to abdicate and placing his brother, Joseph Bonaparte, on the throne. This singular event, forced centuries of Spanish political theory into the forefront and into application. And so I kind of want to go through some of these with you because they're a constant theme, I believe, in this analysis of how we get from Medina to the Alamo. First among these is what we would term provincialism, dating back to as early as Ferdinand and Isabella, the Catholic monarchs. We have a unified monarchy, which is viewed as provinces of equal stature with a common monarch, right? The informal title of the king is Rey de las Españas y las Indias, or King of the Spains, which is plural, and the Indies. We'll get back to that when we get into Mexico's struggle with national identity. The other issue is Spanish municipalism. The basic unit of society under early Spanish thought was the municipal corporation, or the municipalidad, who, in the absence of legitimate authority, could govern under a political structure called a junta, or a committee. And in fact, this early era of Latin American independence is often termed in Spanish la etapa de las juntas, or the era of the juntas. Another topic would be Spanish liberalism, and particularly the Jesuit schools at Salamanca, who opposed some of the Northern European and particularly French views of the divine right of monarchs to rule. Their theory being that the only divine institution was the Catholic Church, and therefore, by definition, the monarchy, the government, was man-made and not divine, and therefore could be perceived as illegitimate. Governance under this theory was by consent, and in the absence of legitimate governance, as happened when, in their view, as with Joseph Bonaparte, then governance would revert to the people in the form of the municipal corporation. And lastly was the idea of criollo aspirations, those being Spaniards born in the Americas who resisted and the higher status and privileges of peninsular-born Spaniards. And the last concept would be the idea of the Catholic monarchs. So beginning with the Reconquista and it was a long chain of events and privileges granted to the Spanish monarchy. The Spanish monarchy held a special role as protector of the Catholic faith, which permeated Spanish identity. So all of these concepts are coalesced into Miguel Hidalgo's uprising in 1810, which sought to reestablish the legitimate Spanish monarch, uphold the Catholic faith, affirm Criollo rights, and establish Mexico's place as equal to the peninsular kingdoms. Hidalgo's uprising got momentum in the northern provinces as they began to declare themselves in support. Ultimately, San Antonio did likewise under the leadership of Juan Bautista de las Casas. And Ruiz's path to Medina begins with the de las Casas revolt. Like many, he remained quiet and observed, and he was still a very young man in his early 20s. But when de las Casas proved to be unpopular with nearly everyone, Ruiz's inner circle of in-laws, associates, friends led the counter-revolt. He took up arms with them and participated in the bloodless counter-coup that reestablished royalist control of San Antonio. De las Casas, his support came largely from the military company stationed at San Antonio. So following the restoration of royalist authority, local loyalists like Ruiz were given high and mid-ranking military appointments. So Ruiz, who lacked any prior military experience, was suddenly appointed assistant quartermaster, and he began his military career. Interestingly, in Ruiz's later retirement pension application, he lists his time of service in the Royalist Army and a bit of patriotic flair, I suppose. He requests the time not be credited to his retirement. But we know from there, because he describes in it, his political conversion. As we know, Bernardo Gutierrez de Lara was an emissary from Miguel Hidalgo, who was sent to the United States to try to get American intervention on behalf of Mexican independence. He failed to do so, but he did get permission to raise an army in Louisiana and to use it as a base of operations. At some point, Reyes and Gutierrez de Lara began a covert correspondence. He discusses this in his pension application as discussing matters of independence. When I first began researching this era, I remember thinking to myself, gosh, these there's no way these illicit correspondences could have survived due to their nature. But after much digging, was able to locate one that survived in the archives in Austin, the state archives. It was misfiled, but there it was, a letter from Francisco Ruiz to Menchaca and Gutierrez de Lara while he was still in the Royalist Army, discussing ways to achieve a bloodless takeover of San Antonio, giving advice on the temperament of the Spanish officers. And he even writes, he even apologizes for how quickly, and I guess his penmanship and whatnot, because he says he's writing hastily at night. So Ruiz is a double agent, or not a double agent, a revolutionary agent within the Royalist Army. He assists Gutierrez de Lara in some fashion in capturing San Antonio, and he takes his oath of independence in the Plaza de Armas, along with the other Texas revolutionaries. This is the first Declaration of Independence in Latin America. It occurs here in San Antonio and in Texas. And Ruiz over the next decade becomes what his contemporaries consider to be the staunchest of liberals. So he's the staunchest liberal of his era, and so he does a complete 180 politically. Obviously, the Spanish aren't going to take that sitting down. They come back, and so as this mixed army of Americans and Tejanos and later Native Americans, they're quite divided. There is political controversy over political leadership. The Americans bring in another agent, Alvarez de Toledo. There is a big power struggle. Ruiz is at that point second in command under Miguel Menchaca of the Tejano forces. They feel betrayed. They support Alvarez de Toledo being brought in, but certain promises which are made are not upheld. In particular, that they would not displace Gutierrez de Lara. And Reyes and Menchaca are planning a court-martial when the Spanish arrive on the horizon unexpectedly. So the Texans take the field at Medina divided with political suspicions, different aspirations, and that, I think, contributes greatly to the disaster that Medina becomes. During the battle, Miguel Menchaca is killed, which leaves Ruiz in command of the Tejano forces. He leads 2 charges into the Spanish line, cavalry charges, which are unsuccessful, and he leads the men off the field of battle. They first go to Presidio La Bahia, where they stop and kind of observe to see what's going to happen next. As we all know, Arredondo, the Spanish commander, enters San Antonio and reestablishes order through the old Roman penalty of decimation, which is the random killing of every 10th person. The Spanish military tradition, much like the Spanish political traditions, viewed themselves as a continuation of the Roman army, Roman military tradition, Roman politics. You often see the king, when his image is unavailable, like on coinage, he's presented as a Roman general. So they do very Roman-y things, Roman-like things, Roman punishments, and the decimation of San Antonio is one of those. Upon seeing that, Ruiz leads the remainder of the survivors into exile in the neutral strip in Louisiana. And let me move the slide over here. Here we go. And so they end up in the neutral strip, which is this area between the United States and Spain that is in dispute. And so by treaty, both countries have agreed not to have a presence. So it's a area without government authority. It's full of pirates and ruffians and counterfeiters and exiles. The Tejanos there's a sumaria filed, which is a political case charging them with treason, and it's full of affidavits of spies. They claim they're at a place called Bayou Pierre, but it's near the Bayou Pierre settlement, what we know of today, in a place called Santa Barbara Rio Hondo, which was a ranch that Francisco Ruiz's brother Antonio had received when he was a presidial soldier stationed there at Los Adayas and then La Nana, which I believe is right here on the border on the Sabine. And that's where the Tejano rebel camp was initially. Conditions were very harsh. We know from the Natchitoches burial records that some form of epidemic swept through the camp, probably typhus, something of that nature, leading to several of the members abandoning the settlement, and some of them joined the American Army prior to the Battle of New Orleans. And about 6 months after Medina or so, there was a general amnesty that was given, but Francisco Ruiz and several others were specifically excluded from that, and a price was put on their head, dead or alive. So Ruiz finds himself a stateless person living in a land with no government, and he really can't show his head anywhere where there is legitimate authority due to the price on his head. And he essentially decides with some of his other contemporaries to continue their struggle via a proxy war through the Comanche. And Ruiz becomes an arms dealer to the Comanche along the Red River Valley. He has agents in New Orleans and in Natchitoches. We were able to locate some of their warehousing records where we found goods that Ruiz was storing in Natchitoches as trade goods. He had grade A credit, so he definitely paid his bills. And for the next 7 to 8 years, he lived among a particular confederation of Comanche called the Tenochitlan, which existed for a very kind of short period of time. The Comanche kind of political structure was fluid, ever fluid, but the Tenochitlan were here along the Red River Valley, and Ruiz was their arms supplier. And during that period, Texas was absolutely decimated itself. In fact, things got so bad that at one point the governor recommended abandonment of the entire province. He said every horse, every mule has been stolen. The province had been depopulated following the Battle of Medina, and it was just constant, persistent raiding by the Comanche. We know a little bit about this time frame in exile because years later, Ruiz led a hunting expedition with Jean-Louis Berlandier, and it ends up in his diary of that expedition. Ruiz was, like a lot of folks who go hunting, they sit around the campfire and they tell stories of the past. And so a lot of those enter Berlandier's diary, and Ruiz tells of his time with the Comanche, going to war against the Osage. He went as far as the Arapaho, which is way over, off the screen over here in southeast Colorado, and even among the Apache. And again, from the Sumarias cases against Ruiz, they accuse him of leading the Comanche on various expeditions down as far as the Rio Grande Valley, and kind of serving as their guide and scout. As Mexican independence becomes more of a political reality, I mean, Mexico kind of had their final achievement of independence was more of a kind of a whimper. It seemed inevitable. Arredondo, who at that point had become Comandante General, who had been Ruiz's opponent at Medina, actually issues him a pardon in exchange for his leading a peace negotiation with the Comanche and the Lipan Apache for the new Mexican government. And Ruiz agrees, and he's gathering provisions in Natchitoches at the same time that Stephen F. Austin is beginning to enter Texas. And so Erasmo Seguin and Austin and Ruiz are at the same point in Natchitoches as he prepares for this expedition. Ultimately, Ruiz is successful. I'll have to skip a lot of the details, but he quickly negotiates a peace with the Lipan Apache down in San Fernando de Asturias, or present-day Zaragoza, and he holds the largest known convention of Comanche warriors on the upper Red River. It's estimated to be about 5,000 warriors. It's a 3-day conference, and Ruiz convinces them that the Mexican empire, that this new Mexican empire, is not the same as the Spanish Empire, that the emperor is born in America, he's an American just like them, and that all past incidences should be forgotten. And so his treaty is rather remarkable. It grants the Comanche Mexican citizenship. It provides scholarships for, I think, 10 Comanche boys each year to be sent to Mexico City to be educated. It respects Comanche territory, and that it promises that for Mexican citizens to pass through Comancheria, they have to do so with passport and guide, and reverse. The Comanches agree to only go through Mexican territory with passports and through guides. There's an exchange of annual tribute. And Ruiz then, or five Comanche chieftains or leaders are elected, and Ruiz leads an expedition down to Mexico City to have the treaty ratified by the Emperor, Agustin, and they do so. And, I remember being down in Mexico City, and you go into Agustin's palace, which ironically is not even, other than the plaque by the bathroom, it's just a generic museum. I don't think Agustin is very well remembered in Mexico, but we were there trying to imagine Ruiz and his Comanche compatriots walking in, and him serving as translator in front of the emperor and signing the treaty. Unfortunately, like a lot of treaties, once Agustin is expelled and the Republicans take over, the new Congress chooses not to recognize the treaty. So the annual tribute is never paid, and it ultimately collapses after a few years. Ruiz then, backing up, Ruiz returns to San Antonio, again a hero, not only having held out for so long in the struggle for Mexican independence, but having, at least for a very short period of time, resolved the ever persistent problem of frontier security. Kind of like, I don't know, maybe the Middle East peace of the day, achieving the seemingly unachievable. He takes up a position as the Indian liaison for the Mexican government, but again, provisions are never provided, and ultimately the treaty fails. Ruiz is recommissioned in the Mexican army, but he encounters a very significant problem in that the Mexican army that is now guarding the frontier were essentially the same individuals who were in the Spanish army with whom he had fought an 8-year proxy war. And so there was a tremendous amount of distrust between the military command and Ruiz. He could not get an assignment. Nobody wanted to champion his cause. He had to appeal directly to the president, and ultimately he was made commander of the Presidio Company at San Antonio, and he didn't really achieve his full restoration until the Fredonian Revolt. And I think I have a slide on the Fredonian Revolt. Oops. Sorry, these are a bit out of order. Well, I'll leave this one up here for now. This is his trade negotiations. During the Fredonian Revolt, initially, the Cherokee and some other tribes agreed to side with the Fredonians, and it was Ruiz, his contacts with the indigenous communities, he went out and negotiated their neutrality, which the Mexican army saw as key to the success of putting down that revolt. As a reward, he was named commander at Nacogdoches, which brought him into an intense rivalry with Elias Bean over who was supposed to be the proper Indian liaison for Nacogdoches. And Ruiz was eventually pulled away from that post again on further Indian negotiations in Texas. And here's his later travels. So in the second round of negotiations, he went as far as New Mexico, and up into the Waco village. And again, I think one of the when we kind of put back the whole Alamo era in focus, a lot of people, what's important to remember that the chief public policy, if you will, issue of the day was frontier security. And in all of these, everything from the De las Casas revolt to the counter revolt to even later Ruiz's understanding of siding with the Texians, frontier security was the #1 issue of the day. And so it's very important to remember that in proper context. So after his second round of peace negotiations, which again were successful but only on a temporary basis, ironically, this case, the Comanche chief with whom Ruiz had negotiated the peace was killed by the Mexican army. The chief was actually in a Wichita camp hoping to aid Ruiz in the negotiations, and the army came in, didn't understand why he was there, thought he had become a traitor, and he was killed. And that was their largest, I guess, indigenous ally was accidentally killed by friendly fire. It was around this time that the Mier y Terán expedition occurs, or boundary commission occurs. They have to, the neutral strip is resolved by treaty to be at the Sabine River, the border between Mexico and the United States, and they are surveying the border. And Ruiz is asked to join the commission because of his relationships with the Native Americans, and he's asked to contribute a report on the Indian tribes of Texas, which is a very important document. Ruiz is unique among his contemporaries for being able to transcend the racial, social constructs of the day. So in the Spanish-Mexican era, there was this idea that Native Americans kind of existed in two general groups. You have gente de razón, or people of reason, and these were Native Americans who adopted a mission lifestyle or agreed to become Christian, or in some sense settled agriculturalists, people that the Spanish or Mexican government viewed that they could work with. And then you had Indios Bárbaros, or barbarian Indians, or sometimes they were called Indios Enemigos, and those were those who resisted any form of assimilation, and they were often targeted for extermination or wars of attrition. The Comanche and the Lipan Apache are always designated as Indios Bárbaros, and so Ruiz's contemporaries generally viewed them as kind of this objectified, barbarian people who could not be reasoned with. But Ruiz's report, since he had lived with them for 7 or 8 years, is unique in that he is trying to transcend that bias. He explains things like their eschatology, their view of the afterlife, their warrior fraternities, their moral system, their long-standing feud, if you will, or with various other groups, such as the Lipan Apaches, kind of an attempt to kind of humanize or have the Mexican authorities, to kind of get into their worldview. And so if you haven't read it, it's not a very long tome. It's probably about 20, 25 pages. Very interesting to see the Comanche from somebody who lived among them and is not simply categorizing them as barbarians. Again, it's this time where we get a lot of Ruiz's information about his time in exile through his communications with Berlandier. And ultimately, Mier Terán's report, they conduct a border survey, but he also gives a report which he finds a very alarming situation in East Texas. He says it's overrun by Americans. They don't have any legal status. They're not living within the constructs the Mexican government has put are set up for immigrants. And he basically says we're going to lose Texas unless we re-Mexicanize it. And so a re-Mexicanization effort occurs. Part of that is to create 5 new cities among the Anglo settlers. They're given hyper-Mexican names like Tenochitlan and Lipanitlan and Anahuac, which becomes notable later in Texas history. And Ruiz is sent into the wilderness to form, establish a post called Fort Tenochtitlan, which is today kind of outside College Station, kind of north of Austin's Colony. It's supposed to be a future new capital of Texas, Mexicanized capital of Texas. And Ruiz then he's again commander of the Presidio forces at San Antonio, which was stationed at the Alamo, and they march out. They locate some land along the Brazos River, and they carve out this rough fort called Fort Tenochitlan. Ruiz had a long-standing relationship with Stephen F. Austin, going back to his first trip into Texas for his first Indian negotiations trip. But here he develops a very lengthy correspondence with Austin, Austin being the impresario, which basically Fort Tenochtitlan is there to protect. And they deal with every sorts of issue, from runaway slaves to Apache raids to Mexican soldiers, stealing from the colonists stealing from the soldiers. All sorts of lengthy correspondence between the two occurs at this time. Ruiz at this time catches an unknown illness. He describes pustules breaking out over his whole body. He's bedridden for a month or so. And it's an illness that he never quite recovers from. And it plagues him the rest of his life, and I believe contributed ultimately to his death. Things get pretty bad out in the wilderness, like a lot of military expeditions at the time. It's under-provisioned. The troops under his command go AWOL and desert in extremely high numbers, like majority of the soldiers. At one point, he has to put his quartermaster on trial for theft. He's convicted, and the sentence is frontier service, his current assignment. So after a year or so, he ends up there. So Ruiz retires. He abandons Fort Tenochtitlan. He returns to San Antonio. He intends to retire to his ranch on the Medina River when revolution comes to his doorstep again. The traditional narrative's kind of thin. If you're drafting a narrative, it's bad characterization. Santa Anna is just Mr. Evil, kind of like Austin Powers. He does evil for evil, but there's a story behind it all, right? There's actors in history generally think they're doing the right thing, or they're trying to achieve a goal, and so Mexico does not achieve its national identity until probably 6 or 7 decades after its independence. So in its early period, it's struggling back with these original ideas that we discussed earlier on about provincialism, for example. What is this Mexican Republic going to be? Is it going to be a national government divided into various provinces with the national government at its top? Or is it going to be a union of independent provinces, again, with a common national government for a limited use? And so provincials like Ruiz and others want it to be a provincial system, which eventually comes to be termed as federalism. And there's this struggle between the centralists and the federalists that isn't really resolved until after the French intervention. And so over the course of this decade, with loss of Texas, the Mexican-American War, French intervention, the centralists finally say it's this divided federalism that's causing all of this political turmoil and loss of territory, and ultimately centralism prevails. But at this time, that hadn't happened yet. And so, within this struggle for national identity, and we see this even in contemporary politics, there's different degrees of reformists. So Santa Anna himself was a federalist. The Congress that was elected alongside him was ultra-reformist. They wanted immediate reforms. They suspended fueros, which are special privileges for the military and the Catholic Church, which outraged those two institutions and a majority of the populace. Santa Anna was supportive of these reforms, but wanted them to be done at a more gradual pace. And ultimately, that's the crisis that led to his suspension of the Congress in the Constitution, calling for new elections. His hope would be for an election of a more gradualist reformed Congress. Texas, I don't want to say it was a complete afterthought, but it was not in the forefront of the activity going on in central Mexico at the time. Now, Ruiz, again, was noted by his contemporaries as being the staunchest liberal of his age. He worked with Erasmo Seguin at the Constitutional Convention against the wishes of the people back home to attach Texas to Coahuila. And the rationale behind that, for example, was they viewed immigration as their as the solution to the frontier security problem. They needed people to provide a good economy and to be a barrier or to resist the Comanche and Apache raids. They viewed that if Texas couldn't be an independent state due to its lack of population, and so if it became a federal territory, immigration would be governed by the Congress in Mexico City. But if it was attached to Coahuila, it would be done at the legislative level, where Texas would have representation. And ultimately, that plan worked out for them. So it's through the Coahuila Tejano legislature that they were able to impose the immigration rules that allowed for massive immigration from the United States and Europe to build up the population of Texas. So with the suspension of the Constitution and the outbreak of hostilities, Francisco Ruiz then is elected by San Antonians to be their representative at Washington de Brazos by one vote. He only won by one vote. Erasmo Seguin, I think, had one vote less, and I forget the other one. There was one vote less and two vote less, and so he barely squeaked in. And he served in the Constitutional Convention. We get some of his insights as to his reasonings later on. He's elected to the Congress as the first senator from San Antonio. And on the day Stephen F. Austin dies, he writes a sentimental letter back home, which is kind of rare. He reaches his surviving correspondence is very formal. He's a military personnel generally. But he writes to his son-in-law, and he's basically saying, I've seen this before, back in Medina. They're coming back. Mexico's not going to just take this lying down. And so the Mexican army is coming back, and when they do, do not side with them, is his advice. In fact, he can't even say the word Santa Ana. He calls them La Culebra, or the rattlesnake. And he says, we've cast our lot with the Americans because they're a freedom-loving people, and they have the arms to defend it. And so I think we see a little bit more that, again, one of his chief motivations is this frontier security. I think what's notable about Ruiz and Navarro is, compared to the other signers of the Declaration of Independence, is they had done this once before. They had declared independence, and Ruiz in particular had lost everything. He lost all of his property. He lost his career path in life. He was forced into exile. Again, we have the advantage of hindsight, but as he went through it, there was no expectation of return. He had sacrificed it all and lost. And so when he signs the Texas Declaration of Independence, he knows very well what that means, what it could mean, because he's been there before. I see that I'm running short on time, so I will cut it short, and we can. If we have any questions, we can address them more. No.
Yeah. Art, again, this was an awesome book, and even as the guy who just talked about Cabeza de Vaca, I think you can make a pretty convincing case that Francisco Ruiz is like the most interesting man in Texas history. And anyway, you've done incredible work pulling a lot of it out of the kind of the shadows of history too. My question, you touched on this a little bit when you talked about like the different conceptions in the Hispanic legal tradition, provincialism and Catholicism and stuff like that. And I think we talked about this one time too, like Timothy Anna's book, about the municipality and what that meant. So I'm recalling back in 1813 when they declare independence, it's kind of a funny document, right? Because they declare independence, but they're also kind of declaring it in anticipation of union with a future Mexican republic. You know, it's not a total independence in like the Anglo-American sense or something like that. And you have the sense too that after 1836, there's some disillusionment amongst the Ruizes and maybe the Navarros and maybe in a different sense Seguin, since he's kind of a different faction. And then we talked about too, you know, Francisco Ruiz's son eventually, you know, flees Texas after annexation because he feels like it's an abandonment of the dream or something like that. What do you think Francisco Ruiz's ideal version, what do you think he thought independence was going to look like in 1836? Or what would he have wanted it to look like in his ideal world?
That's a great question. Hello? Well, let me start by talking about the disillusionment. I mean, it happened very quickly. So Ruiz is elected to be the Texas Senate. The first bill he files, or the first legislation he files, is a resolution asking the Texas Army and the Texas Rangers to stop harassing the Mexican Texans along the San Antonio River and Medina River. And he begs in there for them to understand the unique position that those people were in, that, you know, they couldn't flee to Louisiana like the Anglo population, right? That's where they had nowhere to go. And so most of them remained neutral on the ground. And so that was his plea, was understand that, you know, they would have committed treason. These were just farmers and regular folks, and they had nowhere else to go. And they had this prior experience of Medina. Ruiz, I think, I think the big disappointment, in addition to that, the second-class status that ultimately prevailed, I think, and again, Ruiz dies in January of 1840, so he doesn't see this through. But when Texas votes for annexation, his son is one of the leaders of the opposition. And he writes several letters in Spanish in the local paper, the El Bejareño, which is still existent. And he argues that, you know, Texas has been overrun by illegal immigration from the United States, and only those men who fought for Texas independence should vote for it. And, you know, the quote that comes to mind is he says, distant government in Washington is going to be no different or responsive than distant government in Mexico City. So I would say, I think Ruiz's aspiration would have been to maintain an independent Texas, remain their provincial autonomy, and to kind of, you know, not fall into another subservient or lower political status as his son viewed joining the United States was. And so, as you said, right, not only did he oppose it, ultimately he decided to join the Comanche. He left. He was a San Antonio city councilman, and he decided to go live among the Comanche rather than be an American, which I think is kind of akin to go joining Al-Qaeda or something at the time. It was a dramatic statement of opposition to joining the United States. Yes, and you're right. The two families diverged at that point politically. The Ruiz's, even though Jose Francisco's grandson is elected to the city council after the Civil War, but essentially a decline in the Ruiz's political standing, and the Navarros, who tend to assimilate with the new dominant ruling group, maintain that for much longer than the Ruiz's.
Okay. I have a question.
Yes.
This is not a trick question, but so De Leon and De La Teja historians say the population of San Antonio, Bergen, is 1,800, about 2,000, give or take. I don't recall the exact number, but 2,000. So 1,400 people die at the Battle of Medina, according to Andres. So what is your number? How many people, how many Tejanos died at the Battle of Medina?
I honestly do not know. That is a great question. You know, obviously, a large portion of the Army are American, filibusters or volunteers, however you want to describe them. There is a indigenous companies as well, but you're right. I've seen numbers all across the board, and so I honestly do not know. Though the exile group that ends up in, I can speak more of the exiles, appears to be a group of about 50 to 60, and they barely survive getting there. But the irony is the Ignacio Perez is sent. Ignacio Perez was a local Tejano. He remained loyal to the Spanish. He's the one that was sent to capture Ruiz. Well, that was his brother-in-law. So I kind of think that he kind of looked the other way as they escaped into Louisiana. So I wish I had a better answer for that. Yeah, he was. Yeah, we know he spoke Comanche because he served as the official translator at the imperial court. We know he spoke Cherokee, and we know he spoke the predominant Indian Sign Language of the time. We know he spoke broken English, but he never mastered it. William Gray speaks of that at the convention, that they were teaching each other Spanish and English, in the evenings after of the convention. So he was definitely multilingual. Yes.
I think one of the fascinating things about your study is that up to your book, somebody like Francisco Ruiz was viewed one-dimensional. Here's a Tejano who sides with Austin.
Right.
The discussion you have about him as a diplomat with Lipan and the Comanches is fascinating. I mean, I just never heard of anyone doing. That's pretty dangerous work. So
it is.
Yeah,
No,
I commend you for finding all those documents, and hard to document too. So
Right.
that's very interesting.
And I also found it fascinating that himself and his family were not immune to conflict, despite their relationships and their abilities. His son is abducted along with others in a surveying party. The others are killed, and Francisco Antonio's son survives because he speaks Comanche and relates to his father. So he barely, but he's still kidnapped and he's still held captive for a period. His son Fernando, his nephew Fernando, is killed by the Comanche. They come into the ranch. They say, "Hey, we want a guide. We want an introduction in San Antonio." Ruiz is old. He's suffering from his illness, so he sends his nephew out, and they found him the next day scalped and robbed on the path. And so Ruiz, they form a ranger company, and they go on a punitive expedition. So, despite his whole career, this lengthy diplomatic career, his family itself suffered in that struggle between the various groups. So, yes, sir.
I understand that General Sam Houston had some Cherokee children. Did Ruiz have any children you mentioned?
Right. Not that I know of. There is one story that Berlandier relays. Ruiz talks about he's on a trade expedition with the Arapaho, and the Arapaho had a tradition where they offered him a woman, and he tried to resist because he was married and he's Catholic, and that was he basically is telling Berlandier he barely escaped with his life for his refusal. And ultimately, he conceded. It is. But he says but he does admit that he conceded because he was there on a trade expedition and it would have destroyed everything. But that's it's one of those stories that would not have survived had they not been speaking at camp, hunting years later, and they're relaying war stories.